Welcome to Wednesday night online Bible study for November 4th, 2020. We're still looking at understanding the New Testament, interpretation. Next week, if we get through all of this, which we should be able to tonight, we're going to start looking at inspiration, because that's really an issue that we gloss over, and it's really, really important for us to understand what it means for the Bible to be inspired. And is it possible that means different things in different places in different ways in the biblical text, and certain portions are inspired in certain ways and certain portions are inspired in other ways, and maybe that clouds our perspective? That's just kind of some foreshadowing for where we're going with that. Tonight's really about context, and literary context is important. If you're reading Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, you should read that one way in the context, from a literary standpoint. If you're reading, if you've chosen to read from the book of Psalms, that's poetry. You need to read that differently. If you've chosen to read from the book of Revelation, we need to read that differently, because that's apocalyptic literature. It's its own style of literature. And so we have to be careful that we understand literary context. But there's also historical context, which really is the issue. Most people read the text from their lens, their 21st century lens, and they lose perspective of the original context. Just like I mentioned last week, pizza can be fine dining, or literally be eating it off the trash can, or a manhole cover. Where things are set, how words are said, make a difference. D.A. Carson, considered to be the expert in this, and you may or may not be able to read it behind me as I showed you last week. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. You can make the biblical text say anything you want, anytime you want, any way you want. And so we must be careful not to do that. You want to see how easy this is to screw up biblical literature? Because it's pretty easy. You can do it really easily, really quickly, with no trouble at all. Psalm 125, verse 2. If you read that, it talks about mountains and the thought process of mountains and where they are. And never miss this. What would a mountain have looked like in their time period? It wouldn't have looked like Mount McKinley. It wouldn't have looked like Mount Kilimanjaro. It wouldn't have looked like Mount Everest. It would have been significant for its military position, but it would not have been a mountain. It would not have been even the Ozarks. It would definitely not have been the Appalachians. It would have been just a really big hill. Visualize that as you're thinking in terms of, you've got to kind of understand, grab your resources and try to figure out what that means. And that's kind of an easy context clue. Don't assume a mountain in your time period is the same as a mountain in their time period. Another fairly easy one is Jesus speaking in Matthew 20. And this is the parable of, it gets lots of different names, but it's the one we struggle with. It's the parable of the vineyard owner who gives the same wages to everybody who starts work. Ones who started at dawn, or at 9 o'clock, or at noon, or at 3 o'clock, or 5 o'clock. He gives the same wages to all of them. It seems a little unfair to us, and that text has been used lots of different ways to say lots of different things. That's fine. But the struggle is, we make a big deal about denarius. Well, what's a denarius? Well, you should be able to find some resources to help you with this. Maybe a simple Google search will give you this information. It'll be related to the next one. Denarius was basically a day's wages. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying that, but it'd be a day's laborer's wages. And that helps you get some context as to why it's important. If you were a day laborer, and be careful not to over-apply what a day laborer is in our culture versus their culture. But if you were a day laborer, that's hard work. And I can't imagine that being in a vineyard wasn't hard work in that first century. And I know it's a parable, which is an elaborate story with one main point. But knowing how much that is would make a difference. Building on the money idea, I've dealt with this actually in a recent Bible study that I've written. Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. This is the parable of the talents. The three, we'll call them servants because the Greek's a little vague there. we look at it and it's, one was given so many talents and one was given none and one was given one. And we read that and we hear that the master is very upset with the one who only buried it and brought it back because the other ones doubled their income. And there's lots of different applications here, and we need to be careful with parables, and we'll cover that in a future session, that a parable is an elaborate story with one main point, not 4 or 5, one main point. Any other point we add to it may be dangerous. However, there's a couple dilemmas in that text. It's talent. How much is a talent? What is a talent? Now, if you've heard sermons where they've taken it and said, they were given a talent, they were given 5 talents. And, they turned it into 10. And you should take the talents that you've been given and you should. That's not a bad application of the text. It's not the point of the text. But it's not a terrible application, but how you get there may not be the best solution. Often when we study the biblical text, we get to good conclusions for the wrong reason. And then we start stacking bad theology on top of bad theology. So we have to be careful about that. Matthew 25, 14 through 30. A talent might need a little help, and I'll give you some points and resources to help you with this. But a talent it's been argued in recent study, would be a lot of money. Somebody compared it to $500,000, up to $1 million in our time period. Now, that's a lot that some servants have been given. So this is a really wealthy, powerful owner. Also, when you read that text, Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, you always read it and assume that the third servant is the bad guy. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. However, in original context, we need to consider the possibility that the third servant is the good guy. Why do I say that? And if something seems controversial and I'm not really sure the best way to do this, and this is part of the struggle with context. Often we cannot figure out the context. From a literary standpoint, if I read Matthew 25, the point is pay attention, do what you're supposed to do, be responsible, don't hide and wait, and care for the people around you. It's very obvious that's a literary point of what we know as Matthew 25. However, we also know that one of the things that Jesus hated the most was the way people misuse money and the way people loaned money to other people and kind of extorted them. There were usury laws. These were against Jewish laws. Jesus hated this. It's possible that parable you read in Matthew 25, verse 14 through 30, is really about other people taking that money and loaning it to other places and then charging extortion interest and bringing it back to the master and saying, I charged extortion interest, here it is. If we can determine that from the literary context, and I'm not saying you can or can't, this is a current academic debate. The third servant was the good one, and he did not charge interest from people, and he didn't extort people. And it made his master upset, but then Jesus would be proud. Before you can apply that text for sure, you need to work on figuring out what the original context is. As you can see, I'm just struggling with that, is just based on the Bible study I've written recently, and I've split between the two perspectives. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but if you can't figure out what the original context is, don't build a biblical principle on it. One of the biblical principles is if you can't figure out the context or a text is confusing, try to find another text on that subject or related to that is more clear. Which brings us to this. Make sure you know the purpose and point of the biblical book that you are reading as best you can. Don't just take the little beginning of your study Bible that tells you. You might need to get a Bible dictionary. You might need to do a Google search. You might need to figure out, because it makes a difference. Who wrote Hebrews? We don't know. But learning the purpose of the book and the style that was used helps you to understand who it was written to and why it was written. Who was John? who most likely wrote 1 John, and why was he writing it, and how old was he at the time? Was it written after the Gospels? When was it written? Spoiler, he was probably very old, at least for their time period, and he needed them to get stuff right, which is why he kind of repeats himself in that letter. This is what I keep saying. You need to get a Bible dictionary. Now, it's not going to answer every question you have, but if you have a Bible dictionary, you're going to have the ability to be able to process through these questions. When it's, what about the mountains of Jerusalem? Jerusalem, mountains. You can find it. And most importantly, and I'll use the wilderness desert example as a perfectly good example, you need to read from more than one translation. If you want to understand original context, you need to read from more than one translation. If you just read from one translation, you're probably getting a wonderful translation, but you're getting no perspective of the original language. Read 3 or 4 different respected translations. If you're confused what that means by respected translations, just message me or comment in these videos and I will be happy to point you in the right direction. You don't have to read from the same translations that I read from. Now, if all that seems overwhelming, I want to say one thing, then we'll regroup into the main point of tonight. Well, what if I can't figure out the context? What if I don't understand the context? Then don't build a biblical principle upon it. And the related to that is this. If you're doing your devotional reading, if you're rigid like me and read from the 1-year Bible, does all the work for you, it's already divided, you just got to read it. And all of a sudden you read something, and you haven't really studied it, you haven't grabbed your Bible dictionary, you haven't consulted other people, you haven't met in a group to talk about it, and you read something and it seems amazing to you, and the most inspiring thing you've ever heard. That's okay. God's Spirit can speak to you in similar ways to the ways people who wrote parts of the Bible. If you feel it's telling you to go do something, perhaps that's God speaking to you. I'm not guaranteeing it is, but God works that way. However, probably if that happens without some real study, you have missed the original intent of the text most likely. Now, as we talked about before, reader is interpreter. Most of the biblical text is pretty easy to figure out. Love God, love your neighbor. How do I do that? When do I do that? Okay, I got all that. But some of these things are more complicated. You feel inspired to, go work with lepers in Africa. Great. But you might want a little perspective first. You feel inspired to go do this thing or to do this task based on what you read. That's great, and God could be speaking to you that way, and God does speak to people that way. Often. Sometimes we just don't listen. But understand, you need to not run to the nearest people and say, I read this and this is how God spoke to me and God said this and God said that and this is what you should do and everybody should do exactly what I'm doing. No. The original inspired meaning was to the original group that it was inspired for. We're reading other people's mail. So just be careful saying this is what this text means for sure. Unless you've done at least some rudimentary research and try to consider what the original context is and what the original context might look like. Okay, that brings me to hermeneutics, which is a really complicated word to say something simple. Think of the Greco-Roman god Hermes. He was the messenger. He's that fast one who's all around, and he's Flash before there was Flash in the DC comic world. He delivered the messages. There's even been some modern presentation of him as if he was real life. He would work for the best, UPS service, and he would get everything delivered exactly where it's supposed to go perfectly. Hermeneutics is taking the message of the original context of the original people and taking that message and bringing it to today. The book I keep making reference to by Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, was my textbook in seminary for my first seminary degree for the class hermeneutics. Hermeneutics in that time period is a 2-hour graduate school class you take before you take preaching lab, where they teach you how to take the information you have and then preach it and convey it in a good way. So you're taking the message here. That's the message then. That's the context then. What's the message for today? What can I take from today? Because remember, some contexts, particularities don't translate. But most do. We just need to figure out an equivalent. Hermeneutic, the classic definition, whether you can read this or not, actually I just told you this, it comes from Hermes, the mythical Greek god who was the messenger and herald. And Paul writes in 2 Timothy 2:15, to exert yourself or make every effort to cut the word of the Lord straight. Deliver the message straight and quickly. I'm just going to present to you, before we hermeneutic, and how you would do that, and the mistakes that we often make, and we don't even realize we're making them because we're not really paying attention. I'm just going to give you, I think it's 8 examples. I don't have them on the screen. I only have, the next one on the screen for me, in case you're wondering how this works in my PowerPoint world. All I have is just the next one. I know what it is. But this is why learning the message is important. Figure out the context, apply it to today. Let's take something simple that some of you could relate to, at least why this is important in the context. 1 Corinthians 15:29. You may or may not be familiar with this text. This is from Paul's culmination of 1 Corinthians. He writes all those words to get to the end and say, you believe in the resurrection. Your faith is based in the resurrection. You need to do these things because your faith is based on the resurrection. And all these other silly things you're fighting about do not matter compared to the resurrection. Now, in a line that is very confusing for us, in 1 Corinthians 15:29, and if you're not watching this in the premiere, feel free to pause this and go, did he really say that? Yes, I'm about to say it. 1 Corinthians 15:29, we have a reference to baptizing for the dead. Now, Paul says a lot of phrases in 1 Corinthians, as we're going to get into later, that seem to be very, very specific to that city. It's because we're reading someone else's mail, we're missing something. He does that a lot. It's kind of a problem in the book of 1 Corinthians, is we really have to know a lot about his context to have any clue what we're talking about. However, let's take what we can know. Baptism of the dead. And as students of mine have said many, many times, I thought you told me not to do anything that the Corinthians did, because usually they're going to be wrong. Well, guess what? This is probably another example. But unless you're unfamiliar with the traditions of what we would define as Christian cults, our friends, the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they do baptism for the dead. And they have other what we would define as extra biblical materials that they include in this for this argument. But this is the reference, and they say, well, they were baptizing for the dead then, maybe we should baptize for the dead now. And there's a whole system. That's why our Latter-day Saint friends are so obsessed with genealogy. Because they find all of their relatives and they become baptized by proxy for them. Now, I could sit here and go on for 20 more minutes about what it really meant that they were doing in that time period. But it's not really important for us. It's a particularity to their time. When you read that and hear baptism for the dead, it sounds creepy. It sounds weird. You need to try to think like the first century. What could it have meant in their time period? And if you can't figure it out, and quite frankly, a lot of people just can't, don't try to build a theology around it, as the group in which I have pointed out perhaps does. John 1:1. It's a perfect example of you need to figure out what the message is before you pull it to us. John 1:1. The Word was God. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The Logos. Now, John is using the term Logos, which is an incredibly powerful Greek word that conveys wisdom and logic, and he has made it analogous to God or to Jesus. Now, I could sit here, since apparently I've made fun of one pseudo-Christian cult, now I'm going to make fun of another one. Our Jehovah's Witnesses have to change the biblical text because they understand the context here. and the Word has to be a God. That's a different conversation. You'll notice that in the New World Translation. Clearly not what it says in the Greek, but I won't bore you with that. The Word was God. And John is encompassing all of the image and the wisdom of philosophy and everything good in Greco-Roman culture and lumping it into this one word and saying, yep, God's that too. That's what it would have meant in that time period. And that's that prologue that you read oftentimes during Christmas time or Advent time. The Word was God, and the Word was God, and the Word was with us. And as I've preached recently, and the Word was full of truth and grace. Yes. Need to know. Because if you just read it and go, the Word was God, well, I don't know what that means. Someone just told me that was Jesus. The reason we know that was Jesus is because of how John presents the whole thing, and then we can pull the message out of there. Mark 16:18. One of these texts that I actually don't know off the top of my head. So I apologize for that, but I know what it's going to say, and I know what it says. And you may have read this many, many times now, or maybe you haven't, because as you're going to discover, it may not be in your biblical text. Now, Mark 16:18, I know before I get there, I'm going to, yes. Let me read the whole context, so as not to be unfair. Mark 16, start at verse 15. See if this sounds familiar. Mark's concluding his gospel, or what we have in this preparation. It says, he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and they will drink deadly poison. It will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well. Now, some of you are cringing with, we're going to start handling snakes at church, and I know I joked with one of you at our wiener roast about someone said we're not going to cross the hot coals, and we're not going to do any, Daniel in the lion's den and burning bush and the fiery furnace. Someone said, well, what about handling snakes? And I made this statement. Well, that's a really cool idea. I hear that's in the Bible. Or maybe it's not. A couple things you need to consider: context, literary context. You can find this in any Bible in your footnotes. It will tell you that starting at verse 8 of Mark 16 is not in the early manuscripts. We have no good reason to believe it was there originally. Now, it's included because there's some much later manuscripts that include it. What I'm basically telling you is the context in this one is easy. It's not there. You'll see parentheses around verse 9 all the way, I think, to verse 20 in that Mark. It's not there. The context is very simple. What's the context? This was written later. Now you're thinking, well, that makes me feel better because I didn't want to handle snakes. Before you get excited about things that are written later, let me introduce you to the next one about delivering the message. You're more than happy to tell people, hey, I wouldn't build theology on Mark 16:18 because it wasn't there originally. Be careful, because there's what you know as John 7:53 through 8:11, which also appears at the end of Luke's Gospel, in the middle of Luke's Gospel in some manuscripts, at the end of John's Gospel in some manuscripts. You know it as the woman caught in adultery that they were going to stone. Spoiler alert again, it's not in the early manuscripts. And how many times have you heard ministers preach this text or use this example, or maybe you've used this example? If you're going to throw out contextually, not to deliver the message of Mark 16 of handling snakes and drinking poison, be careful that you don't contextually, even though I can probably tell you who wrote that and when they wrote it, much later, by the way. Don't run to go and sin no more as a message to live by. Because if one is proper, then the other one has to be proper, and now some of you are cringing like, uh-oh, I don't like this. Related to that, know your culture, the message. 1 Timothy 6:10. I'm sure you're familiar with 1 Timothy 6:10. Some of you, think 1 Timothy 6:10 is one of the best, most inspired texts in all the Bible. Maybe some of you are like, I still don't know why you're making a big deal about 1 Timothy 6:10. 1 Timothy 6:10 is, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have withdrawn from the faith and pierced themselves with many grief. This is literary context and pulling the message out. The phrase is, for the love of money is a root of all evil. So the message you should apply to today is, if you love money more than something else, then you're leading to evil. Not money itself is evil. Not even love of money is technically evil in this context. It's the love of money is the root of it. It's careful how you deliver that message, because you know all the things that we think the Bible says, and it never really said, like, God will never give you more than you can handle. By the way, that's not in the Bible. This is one of those things that gets exaggerated through time. How you deliver the message is important. Think of the telephone game. And if you're too young to remember the telephone game, where you whisper and you send a message, and by the time it gets all the way around, it's a totally different message. We need to be careful to convey the original message as best we can. I've got 3 more for you, and then we'll pray for tonight. But I just want you to get the idea of how important delivering the message is. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We hear people use that all the time. And they say, well, you can do it because Christ can strengthen you. Okay, just remember, Paul is writing from prison, talking about joy, and what he can do at that point may not be all things. Let's be careful that the message Paul's writing may not be the same message that you're saying. Related to that is, of course, is, of course, the Jeremiah 29:11 passage that I'll get to in a minute, that I have plans for you to prosper, and all these, which is a great, wonderful text. Understand that that's being written for Jeremiah, who, if you read the rest of Jeremiah, goes to prison, gets swindled by his family, and no one really wants him, and spends life in Egypt. God had plans, and Jeremiah prospered, but not in the way we always think. This one's the tricky one, Matthew 7:1. Obviously, I remember it in King James, so I apologize. Judge not, lest you be judged. Now, there's more to the text than that, but I just want us to get an idea of conveying the message. What does it mean to judge in the first century? What did Jesus mean? Jesus didn't say, do not judge others. Jesus said, based on standard Jewish pattern and standard understanding of the Greek syntax and all these other things, I need you to judge, but you need to judge yourself, and then go help others. So you see some sin that you think is awful. Before you say anything to that person, look at your life and anything that anywhere relates to that sin. So I know, hot button issue, and I know I've mentioned it several times. I just want to point this out. If you feel someone is committing a sexual sin, either with a lifestyle, how they live, what they do, any of those kind of things, you are called by God, according to the Sermon on the Mount, to judge that person. However, you don't get to do any of that until you've dealt with all the issues that go on in your world. And if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is pretty tough on sexual sins and sexual thoughts. Just understand, the message can get lost. The original message was, see sin, judge yourself, get it together, because that's the way you deal with the log that's with you. And then go help the speck that's in their eye. That's the context. The message is, you see a sin, you should help. You should speak for them. You should speak up. But you need to deal with all your stuff first. Then go. That's why we talk about dealing with your own issues before you start judging other people. And some of you have heard me rant lately about the people who are so critical of certain sexual lifestyles and certain sexual practices are the same people who are committing horrible sexual sin in their life. I know I'm kind of finishing this section of this on a bummer, but it's all in how you deliver. You get the message, and then you deliver the message. Don't deliver the message in such a poor way that it can't be received. Don't take the message and the glory of God and wrap it in a garbage bag and hand it to someone. The biblical text was an amazing thing, and we should be careful in how we use it. As you can see, the last one is Jeremiah 29:11, I've already mentioned. This is what we need to do. This is how we need to do it, and we need to do it carefully. I'm going to come back next week and talk about Matthew 18 if you want to read ahead, and then we will pick up and go into inspiration next week. Thanks for participating. Hopefully it helped a little bit. We've got a few more of these things before we can get into the practical aspect of reading the epistles and reading the apocalyptic literature and going from there. Let me pray for us, and then we'll see you next time. Holy God, thank you so much. Thank you that you are who you are. Thank you that you love us in ways we can't even imagine. But most of all, help us to trust in you as the one who has given us your word. And it has come to us in so many amazing ways. Help us to recognize that often we don't read it very carefully and we forget who it was originally written to. Help us to be careful, to make an effort, to try hard, and admit sometimes we just can't figure it out. So that we can be your people. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.